So, hello BookTube, welcome back to another book review, and a special welcome to my fellow members of the Clapham book group if you are tuning in. So today I'm going to be talking about Guernica by David Boling. Hopefully I'm pronouncing both of those correctly, which was our pick for last month's book club. And I have a rather mixed feelings about this book. So I thought in this video it would be a good place to explore why. Because, so on one hand I kind of enjoyed the book, at least so kind of in a vacuum, away from any context. I enjoyed the story and I enjoyed reading it. But I didn't like it as much because of kind of what the story sets out to be and how it's sold. So if you read the back, it talks about how it's an epic novel. Blurbier saying it's a multi-layered saga, and it's just about rich in the history of the region. The Red Baron, the Luftwaffe, and even Picasso make appearances in Guernica, as the fate of the Navarre family is traced through the early decades of the 20th century. So that's kind of the thing. So Guernica is, of course, the name of a town in northern Spain, in the Basque country, and it's famous for being bombed during the Spanish Civil War, and then Picasso making a painting about it. And so that is, in a sense, what this book is, of course, about, and what it's leading up to. And that is why it kind of feels for me. Because so we start with a long section. I think about the first 2/3 of the book are set before the bombing, at the end of the 19th century and start of the 20th, and they paint this picture of life in the Basque Country as it was at the time. And so that's a very pastoral scene, right? So it's all kind of happy and beautiful, and makes you want to live there, and it's all kind of like almost a paradise on earth, and that just doesn't ring true. And I think it's, you know, it's fine. There's a very long, 2,000-year tradition to write stories about life in the countryside and how much more wonderful life would be if we could just all go back, leave the city behind, and all go back to being farmers, just like our granddads. I mean, the ancient Romans had books like that. But when you're writing a book about a historical event, and it's really supposed to be about that historical event, and there's a dedication, if I remember correctly, you know, to so the dedication for the victims of Guernica and all the Guernicas that followed. If you want your book to be about that, I think the pastoral setting just didn't work for me, because it was almost a fairy tale. So I think I said, you ready? But it was all too good to be true the time before the bombing, right? So that way of life, you know, there was never a bad harvest, people didn't get sick or you know, get thrown overboard and drown in fishing boats. All the hardships of, you know, the rural life, especially, you know, on non-mechanized farms where everything's still done by hand, was swept under the carpet. You know, it's supposed to be this happy place, and yet if a father loses his wife in childbirth, he's left to bring up his children all by themselves, and the neighbors don't really seem to care much about them, even though when there seems to be something bad going on the farm, they just, you know, completely ignore it. So there doesn't seem to be a very supportive community. We also never get to see much of the community, so the story itself focuses in on the small group of characters, and they also are rather lacking in depth, I found. So again, as a fairy tale it works. As a fairy tale where you kind of just get a few character sketches and that's enough to get to know the characters and follow their adventures, it works. But as a story about real human beings who were affected by a horrific event, it didn't for me. Because we don't get enough of these characters to really make them into fully fleshed human beings, rather than kind of fairy tale figures that have a few defining features that we recognize them by and love them for. So as an example, we have from the main character Justo and his wife Maria Angeles, and Maria Angeles wants lots of children, and Justo doesn't want that because he's scarred by the experience of his mother dying in childbirth, giving birth to his youngest brother. And so we get precisely one paragraph of them having a disagreement about it. Might stretch to calling it an argument, definitely not a real quarrel. And then that's never spoken about again, right? And I don't want to be super cynical and say that should fester forever and destroy their marriage, because people can work things out, but it's not worked out in the book. It's just kind of briefly mentioned to kind of pretend that there's depth to these characters, and then forgotten about completely. And there are more points in the story where it's similar kind of disagreements are just kind of briefly brought up and then completely forgotten about, which makes these characters into characters rather than human beings. And then it lessens the impact of Guernica itself happening. It also lessens the impact that, like I said, we only focus on the small family rather than on the community as a whole, so you're not really affected by what happens to the rest of the community all that much. Also, read you from the blurb, it talks about the Red Baron and Picasso making an appearance. The Red Baron also gets precisely one paragraph, or maybe gets two paragraphs, but certainly not more than a page. And it's completely irrelevant to the rest of the story, right? You're just kind of putting it in there because the Red Baron's cousin is the one who will eventually be in charge of the German bombers that bomb Guernica. So we get a passage describing the death of the Red Baron, but that is no connection to the rest of the story, right? You could at least try and connect it via that cousin, make the cousin influenced by the event, because the Red Baron was, according to this book, in real life there are multiple theories, but according to this book he was distracted because he was trying to save his cousin, and that's why he managed to get himself shot down, along with having some hay fever medication. So, maybe that scarred his cousin or motivated him in his later life, or maybe didn't. We don't know, but this book certainly doesn't advance any theories on that. And then because of that, this whole Red Baron thing is completely disconnected to the rest of the story. So, okay, he was the cousin of the guy that led the bombers, but why not talk about any of his other cousins, or his parents, or his brothers or sisters, or his pet dog? I don't know. Right? None of those influenced him, but the Red Baron didn't either. So why is the Red Baron in here, other than you wanted to be able to put on the cover that you put the Red Baron in your book? And the same thing really for Picasso. So, of course, Picasso famously made a painting inspired by Guernica. And so therefore, to involve Picasso in the story somewhat makes sense, but what it really means is we get lots of vignettes kind of breaking up the main storyline, where we see Picasso going for a drive through the Spanish countryside, or having tea with his mistress in Paris somewhere. But again, there's no connection to the story, right? And the only connection is eventually makes his painting, and there are two characters which are introduced relatively near the end of the story, basically to act as plot devices to resolve a plot point that otherwise would be really hard to resolve. And they go and see his painting and think it's great. Well, I think that the painting is a good painting. That's it. So, all of that kind of made it a bit of a disappointing read for me. And so, but at the same time, I did like the story, right? So that's the strange juxtaposition. So, as a story, as a fairy tale of, some people having a countryside kind of semi-idyllic life, and then a bad thing happening, and then having to deal with that and re-find happiness, it worked. As a story about Guernica, or about the horrors of war, I think it failed. And as a historical novel, or as a connection to a piece of actual history, I think it failed very badly. And so in the end, that gives me this kind of conflicted feeling where, yeah, I liked the story in isolation, but I didn't like it as a story that is setting out to do something. I hope all of that makes sense. And I hope that you'll be around next time for, if I finally left it, yes, a story that does much better talking about the horrors of war, in my view, and that is Frankenstein in Baghdad. Like I said, that will be next time. See you then. Bye bye.